Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts.
Hello. In this podcast, we'll be exploring the latest trends in planning and the backdrop this provides for the government's ambitious planning reforms and house building targets. I'm Paul Marshall, geospatial consultant with Landmark Geodata, and joining me today are Josh Rains and Ed Griffiths. Let's begin with some introductions.
Well, guys, so I'm Josh Rains, Managing Director for Landmark Geodata. Landmark Geodata provides a range of data and solutions across the land and property industry, but also further afield, predominantly focusing on the supply of geospatial information, and looking forward to having a conversation today.
Morning, everybody. I'm Ed Griffiths. I'm Head of Business and Client Analytics at Barbour ABI. Barbour ABI is the UK's leading provider of built environment project intelligence and insight. We track all planning applications across the UK from their initial application all the way through to their completion, and value add with fundamental desk research that helps people understand what's happening in the built environment.
Fantastic. So let's start with the headline trends we're seeing. So what are we seeing in the planning world, and is there a sort of difference between the residential and commercial sectors?
So big picture is that the planning application trend is that we're seeing an overall decline. So if we look at 23 to 2024, we saw around a 9% decline from a volume perspective and around a 5% decline from value perspective. So when you see a dynamic like that where one is declining at a faster rate than the other, it tells you something, and in that instance it tells us that big things are still happening and it's smaller projects that are really suffering. If we think about residential and commercial, it's relatively similar. So both residential and commercial, both in decline from 2023 to 2024. Really, the only kind of trend setter there, if you like, it would be infrastructure projects. Infrastructure projects are an area where we've seen growth, and there's a little bit of resilience in some of the commercial projects as well. But broadly, I would say that both are very similar. If we look at 2025 so far, if I just did very crude forecasting where I took the first quarter and then trended that literally napkin maths for the rest of the year, we would expect to see a decline for this year as well. So 24 into 25 also declining, which is not a brilliant thing to be seeing, but I actually think that maths doesn't do what is happening at the moment justice. So I actually think that we'll probably start to see year-on-year growth from a month perspective towards the end of this year, and then going into 2026, I hope to be able to say that that's when we'll start to see growth back into the construction industry.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we look at sort of resi versus commercial. I think what we typically see and what we've seen across Landmark, across some of the sort of transactional side of things as well, is the volatility that resi can have in terms of its speed of reaction of market forces, both positively and negatively, tend to be a more immediate sort of change that we see. Obviously, when we talk resi applications, there's a lot of other contributing factors than just sort of macroeconomics that drive a lot of those, whereas maybe it's fair to say from a commercial side, the trends tend to be a little bit more longer term and less sort of knee-jerk reactions in terms of some of those, which is some of the fascinating stuff that you see in terms of that variability between the two. And we, for a long time, you sort of spend time agonizing over, well, which one's leading the other and that sort of stuff. But often what it comes down to is residential is that sort of confidence statement in the policies and trends that we see across the board, and commercial will tend to take a broader view, and that's why I typically expect it to be a little bit more slower to be sort of declined, but also slower to recover sometimes in that capacity.
Yeah, it's all about momentum, isn't it, in construction in general, and a lot of what we're seeing from the Labour government at the moment is around an attempt to start to put momentum back into it. So if you think about Labour, as in not the government, but literally, but as in the workforce, the things that they're saying and doing at the moment are with an eye to try and get people back into construction. If you think about the total construction workforce over the last 5 years or so, you're looking at about a 14% decline in the number of people that are in the construction industry. So it's about 350,000-ish less people in the construction industry. We need people back into construction to start delivering on things like 1.5 million more homes. We need them back in to start delivering on really important infrastructure projects for us to be able to start realising some of the economic upturn that the government's really banking on with some of their policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the large scale sort of and infrastructure stuff, what do you think sort of keeping that that area of it fairly stable. Is that again driven by the factor that a lot of it was underway and sort of commitments and investment has been made in terms of that, or is anything that you saw across that side? Because I think that's an interesting sort of dynamic on that piece.
Big projects are typically quite a bit more resilient to some of the economic sort of winding roads that we found ourselves on, because obviously they take a long time to start. The funding secured well in advance, and they'll obviously then run for some time. If you think about what the Labour government has done since they've come in, they've set out several new initiatives like NISPs, whatever acronym you might refer to them as. So recognising that infrastructure is incredibly important, think projects being prioritised. I was at a conference earlier this week talking about data centres in the UK, and obviously data centres have been elevated to being part of critical infrastructure now as well. And just this week, I think it was Technology Week in London as well, and the CEO of NVIDIA was in London saying that the UK is sort of probably the third most attractive market to invest in from an AI perspective, but it's a Goldilocks situation where the infrastructure isn't there, but it could be there very soon. And that was the sentiment at the conference that I was at. There's a lot of excitement in infrastructure, but specifically data centre infrastructure, going from strength to strength to strength. We're talking about a construction value of around 2 million 2 years ago. By 2030, it'll probably be 4 to 5 billion. So, really, really ramping up. And subsequently, that will. You talk about these dual site operations where the data center, but also the power hub for the data centers there as well. But that, when you establish that infrastructure, it obviously has a kind of a ripple effect on the surrounding area as well. So that's why that type of investment is important, but it's also why that type of investment is probably more resilient to some of the downturn. Yeah, exactly.
Sort of more established in terms of that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, picking up on the sort of on both sector sides specifically, obviously some very ambitious targets across both. But on the residential side of things specifically, what kind of context do you think that gives the planning reforms that the government has announced?
So the spending review this week, I thought, offered a bit of interest. So £39 billion over 10 years for social housing. Social housing, for the events that I've had the privilege of attending in the construction industry since I've sort of started my career at Barbour, social housing seemed to be a prickly topic. So it puts a lot of pressure, I think, on the supply chain, and it puts a lot of pressure on the builders as well, because obviously delivering social housing, it comes at a cost, and that cost sits with the developers. So it's very, very tricky. 1.5 million homes, if you just did, again, I'm a big fan of napkin maths, if you just did napkin maths when Labour came into government, the slope of sort of homes being completed year on year on year, if you do, however you do it, it looks ridiculous. So it's what that suggests to us is that the backward trend isn't there to support that 1.5 million homes is realistic in their first term. If they are fortunate enough to have a second term, you would hope that they would have laid the groundwork to be able to deliver on 1.5 million homes, and that would be things like upskilling and more skilled workers, but it would also be addressing some of the challenges that house builders face with regards to demand and that type of thing. I also think that they're possibly treading a very thin line with regards to things like putting handcuffs on developers. So I can't remember the name of the policy, but putting handcuffs on developers into saying to them, if you don't hit your targets, we're going to come for you from a financial perspective. So almost financially handcuffing people to their targets. But surely they have to realise that if the demand isn't there and the sort of the fiscal responsibility of the company to operate in a profitable way, they're not just going to build houses because they have to build houses to hit a target. So it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it, to say we really want to push and we need the support of all these people in the construction industry, but then also tagging that on at the end of the sentence seems a bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's particularly from the residential sense, it's visualising the whole process as that pipeline. Often we talk around the transactional process as a pipeline in terms of listings and moving through the earlier stages of a sale, but actually we're taking this all the way back now to planning and then construction and viewing the whole pipeline as a flow. And there's policy changes here which are promoting it, sort of filling the pipe with new opportunities. So the brownfield first policies, grey-belt, and sort of promoting and bringing forward sites to bring sort of pull areas of land and opportunities forwards, but there's also got to be that focus on the push and the capability for properties to move out the other side once they are built. And as you say, typically even in these larger schemes, they're built in terms of a flow of process. So you sort of get the first band of properties they sell, then we move on to the construction of the next one, and it's making sure there's that thorough sort of flow through of the pipeline all the way from, like we're saying, the start of the planning application process through to the sale of an individual plot and property. And I think what's going to be really interesting over the next couple of years is how we get the interplay between the different sort of specific planning reforms all the way through to some of the changes that we're seeing in the transactional stuff to sort of act as both a push and a pull through that pipeline process.
I think another interesting point on residential specifically is the digitisation push.
Yeah.
So when I joined Barbour and kind of started looking around the world of construction, I was quite surprised at how there is, it's not unreasonable to say that in some areas construction is probably lagging 30 years behind some other industries in terms of how much it's embraced technology. And if you look at local plans, that's a really good example of it, where some local plans, and I won't say which local authorities are great and which are poor for obvious reasons, but some local plans, you can go on there, you can go onto a very swish Esri map. It's got lovely layers, not dissimilar to the types of products that you guys deliver. Got lots of lovely layers. You can peel things in, put things on there, and really get a feel for what the plan is. You go to some other local authorities, and it's a PDF. You're scrolling through 300 pages, and you don't really know, and it's hard to piece it all together. And I think from a residential perspective, digitisation like that will give a central view on how we're doing and where we're doing it. But it's great having a system, but if you don't actually increase activity as well and stimulate activity, the system won't do anything.
Yeah, and I think that system applies to all aspects of it, and digitalisation is a fascinating sort of view of that. We were at a talk yesterday with HMLR discussing their plans about how they're digitising all aspects of the register, and then how they want to be moving that forward to the geospatial sort of sense and view to better inform the sort of earlier stages again of giving data up front to be able to make much quicker decision-making processes and investment decisions on where is a feasible site and where isn't. So again, that's all sort of capabilities to promote that pull of new sites and new opportunities at the earliest stage.
Definitely. There's a lot of drivers you mentioned already, such as the large economic growth areas that are in there. But what else are you seeing as the key drivers, particularly on the commercial side from application activity?
So commercial really is just going to be probably underpinned by infrastructure. We spoke about it a little bit at the start. Infrastructure in the UK has probably been lacking investment for a number of years, and I think Labour have laid out quite a clear plan and really emphasised that infrastructure is the top of their agenda, probably followed closely by things like the NHS. But really, I think it's just investment in that. I've also read about and seen examples of tactical uses of change of use applications. So again, it's being sort of slightly savvy with how people are behaving and operating in the market to try and get around some of the lags that they can experience through the planning application process.
Yeah, I think so. I think and you spoke about the role of data centres, I guess, from the infrastructure as well, being a huge driver. But that's change of use statement is a really fascinating one. As we sort of, it sounds cliche, but still sort of get to grips with the sort of usual working practices and the balance between work and daily life. What one of the key messages sort of heard at recent conferences at the UK Reef, for example, was a real focus on development of place as a sort of strategy for investment decisions. And what I think I really mean by that is not viewing properties and areas as it's office or it's commercial or it's residential. It's really designing a space and a place that works across all of those. So viewing it in the context of the building, and there was a statement made of viewing properties beyond their red line boundary and actually the influence that they can have. And I think that's going to drive a lot of our change of use applications where it was perhaps considered predominantly an office block or maybe even healthcare or that sort of things, as they go through sort of acquisition disposal strategies, starting to view it more in a capacity of mixed use that can promote valuable and ESG benefits across not just the property itself but the local community around it. And I think that sort of view of property is going to really drive a lot of change of use and redevelopment activity in the commercial sector, where it's predominantly an office block to start with, but actually it now needs to be viewed to be a sound and future-proofed investment decision. It now needs to be viewed as a mixed-use sort of capability, and seeing that, particularly within London, but I suspect we'll start to see that sort of move into some of the more urban areas across the country as well.
I think as well, the fact that we're seeing return to office policies varying across industries and across different companies, but I think ultimately the general sentiment is back to the office a bit. Not necessarily all the time, but back to the office a bit. But that obviously has implications for the office stock and commercial buildings as a whole. And I think getting people back to the office, it's got to be a nice office to go to. Yes. So the trend that we're seeing is refurbs and high-spec offices, not run-of-the-mill offices that perhaps we've all operated in our careers in the past.
So certainly an interesting landscape right now. But if we look to the future, how do you see the impact that the National Planning Policy Framework, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and say the other regulatory requirements legislation that's coming out are going to affect planning application trends over the next 12 months and beyond?
Well, Ed, I guess you said it right at the start in terms of expecting to see some of that recovery coming through. I think the interesting side from my perspective is going to be what's that balance look like between resi and commercial. I started, one of my earlier comments was sort of how reactive the resi sort of application market can be in terms of bounce back ability across those versus commercial, which tends to be sort of that confidence driven and therefore sort of slower sort of return. I think the reality being is that these ambitions and these policy spaces are created to drive activity through the industry and move it through there. The challenge will be the sheer volume of change that we're seeing as part of it. Being able to digest and understand new definitions like grey belt, new 5-year housing targets as part of it, and really not just in the public sector in terms of adopting the processes, but really focusing in the private sector in terms of, well, what is the expectation on us? What does good look like from a reclassification of green belt to grey belt definitions, and how do we actually manage that practically as we move forward? So we're seeing it into the industry already with some of these reclassification examples, but I think given the sheer volume of change, it's going to be a period of time of adjustment as the market sort of trends towards where the opportunities lie. But Ed, not sure what your views are on that side.
I think the appointment of Becky Wood as the chief executive of NISP is quite inspired. It says a lot about where their head's at, sort of moving towards more professional project delivery, but also prioritising strategic infrastructure. So, as I understand it from what I've read, Becky Wood's experiences around delivering some of the very biggest transport and infrastructure projects in the world. So that hopefully only bodes well for the leadership that can be governed from that. I think I'd mirror similar points to yourself. Gradual recovery in residential, how quickly, it's really dependent on how quickly other things happen, probably. I think a lot of people want it to be very quick. From a commercial perspective, it will be selective, so the things that matter will still matter, and the things that don't matter at the moment probably still won't matter in 6 to 12 months. Whether planning bills can streamline the application and permission process, I don't know. The local authorities will still have bottlenecks. There still aren't enough people to approve applications. A lot of those people obviously leaving during COVID and some of the tougher economic times we felt more recently in construction, so there'll still be bottlenecks. ESG as well, considerations there. It's increasingly vital. I don't think it's a nice to have anymore. I think it's a de facto requirement now. And I think that's possibly a struggle for some people, but I think it's a positive for the world as a whole, and for the places that you were talking about from a construction and from a conceptualisation perspective. I think it's very interesting for the future in terms of the trends that are happening. So we just have to wait and see, I think.
Yeah, I think your point there on ESG is really key, and I think one of the fascinating things that we'll start to see is what does the balance between the E, S, and G sort of look like. I think environmentally, often a lot of those are quite understood in terms of the value add that you can add as part of property and infrastructure. The social side is still one that is driven a lot by place-specific requirements. What is the value that can be contributed to a local area? What is the value that's specific to my building or my type of organisation or my tenants and those sorts of things? So I think how we see that come through as part of both investment decisions, but as part of the planning process and the considerations from the local authorities is going to be a fascinating trend that goes alongside some of the sort of increases activity that we all hope to see.
I think as a final point, in answer to your original question, I appreciate we've gone a bit broader here, but I think the idea of co-location projects, I don't think that's a trend that we've seen as much of as we will yet. So I use the example of data centres and energy hubs, I imagine that we will see more and more people tacking on to the back of these hotbeds of development, wanting to make sure that they've got their place in the sun, so to speak. So I think we'll see a lot more of that, and that's something that we'll be tracking really closely at Barbour.
So it's an interesting place, and there's definitely a lot going on. But for any developers who are listening, what are the opportunities you see that they could take advantage of from sort of where we are in the planning world right now?
I think, just if you don't mind me jumping in very quickly, from an SME perspective in the house building market, I think it's a very exciting time, although it may well be a very challenging time. Obviously, some of the very larger house builders have pulled back in the last few years and are perhaps waiting to see what happens. There's obviously opportunities there for SMEs with the current climate and the government pushing hard on house building, for them to be able to step up and perhaps fulfill in areas that historically they might not have felt comfortable, or they might not have got a look at.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the policies themselves bring forward new opportunities. We briefly touched on the sort of grey belt capability as a new route for new sites, but also revisiting old sites and challenges that have been moving those sort of forwards. Being from a data organisation, I wouldn't be able to go through this whole conversation without sort of making the statement of moving towards sort of data-led decision making as a driver for moving some of the sort of acceptance criteria for investment and progression as early as possible. And it's a trend that we saw in some recent research that we undertook in terms of the volume of developers planning to increase their use of AI in 2025. I think sort of 73% was the point from that perspective. And really what that means is stronger data foundations required to make real insight using those sort of new technology capabilities, and that's sort of an opportunity that, alongside the policy perspective, the technology is going to be key. But overall, I think it's a time for collaboration across the market. It's only really going to be through practice and through real life examples of progressing applications through the pipeline between both developers, SME or larger enterprise organisations, and the local authorities and the infrastructure providers to really understand the best possibility for unlocking sites and navigating sort of through these changing policies, and where the opportunities lie for each to progress for the sort of national good, I guess, across that.
I think in the current climate, where risk tolerance is probably very low at the moment, and there's a lot of perceived risk, retrofitting and reuse is probably something that will be a trend. I think it's a logical thing to assume. And then we've spoken about it quite heavily because I do think it's a big trend at the moment. But mixed use will probably be another trend that we will see, just because obviously you can mitigate risk by getting more people into the party, so to speak. So I think those are two big trends we'd be watching. Typically, when you see a fall in applications, you typically see a lag of about 2 years thereafter from a construction output perspective. So if we think we're in the trough of the decline in planning applications at the moment, which I alluded to at the very start of this conversation, you would presume that we are hopefully going to start to see construction output start to see reasonable uptick in the not too distant future as well.
Well, look, thanks, Ed and Josh, for the conversation today. We've talked around the vast amount of activity that is currently existing in the residential and the commercial sectors, and the different types of opportunity that span both policy changes, application type, and the growing data technologies that underpin all of that. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Landmark Talks property channel, where you can hear all the episodes in our planning mini-series.
Thank you for listening to Landmark Talks Property. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.